Margaret Thompson stepped out of her old blue car and looked up at the tall glass building in front of her. The Golden State Music Competition was held here every year, and she had dreamed of this moment for so long. Her hands were shaking a little as she grabbed her worn black music bag from the back seat. At 52 years old, she knew she looked different from the other people who usually came to these fancy music contests. She wore her best dress, a simple blue one with small white flowers that she had bought 3 years ago for her daughter's wedding. Her gray hair was tied back neatly, and she carried herself with quiet dignity. But compared to the young musicians walking into the building with their expensive clothes and confident smiles, Margaret felt very out of place. The morning sun was bright as she walked toward the entrance. Other contestants were arriving too, and Margaret could not help but notice how different they all looked. There was a young man in a perfectly pressed black suit carrying a leather case that probably cost more than Margaret made in a month. A girl who looked about 20 walked past wearing a beautiful red dress and high heels that clicked loudly on the pavement. Her blonde hair was styled perfectly, and she moved like someone who was used to being on stage. Margaret had driven for 3 hours to get here from her small town of Millbrook. She had left her house at 5 in the morning, before the sun came up, because she wanted to arrive early and have time to prepare. The drive had been peaceful, giving her time to think about the piece she would play and to calm her nerves. She had practiced this moment in her mind so many times, but now that she was actually here, everything felt surreal. As she walked through the glass doors, Margaret was amazed by how fancy everything looked inside. The lobby had marble floors that shined like mirrors, and there were huge crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. Fresh flowers were arranged in expensive-looking vases, and classical music played softly in the background. It was nothing like the small community center, where she usually performed for the local church events. The registration desk was busy with activity. A long line of contestants waited to sign in and get their performance numbers. Margaret joined the line and looked around at the other people waiting. Most of them were young, probably in their 20s or early 30s. They all seemed to know each other, talking excitedly about music schools and teachers she had never heard of. Their conversations were full of fancy musical terms and names of famous composers and performers. The girl in front of Margaret was talking loudly on her phone. "Yes, I'm here at the Golden State competition," she said, in a voice that sounded very pleased with herself. "My teacher thinks I have a real chance of winning this year. She says my Rachmaninoff is absolutely perfect." Margaret listened quietly, feeling more nervous by the minute. She had never had a famous teacher or gone to a music school. Everything she knew about piano, she had learned on her own or from old books she found at the library. Behind Margaret, in line, 2 young men were discussing their performance pieces. One of them was planning to play a very difficult piece by Liszt, and the other was preparing something by Chopin. They spoke about these composers like they were old friends, using first names and making jokes about the technical challenges. Margaret felt her confidence slipping away. Her chosen piece suddenly seemed too simple, too basic for such an important competition. When Margaret finally reached the front of the line, the young woman behind the registration desk looked up at her with surprise. She was probably about 25, with perfectly styled hair and makeup that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Her name tag said Jessica, and she wore a bright smile that seemed a little fake. "Can I help you?" Jessica asked, looking confused. She glanced around as if expecting to see a younger person nearby who might be the actual contestant. "I'm here to register for the competition," Margaret said quietly, placing her completed application form on the desk. Jessica looked at the form, then back at Margaret, then at the form again. Her eyebrows went up in surprise. "Oh," she said, clearly not expecting this answer. "Are you sure you're in the right place? This is the Golden State Piano Competition. It's quite advanced." Margaret felt her cheeks getting warm, but she kept her voice steady. Yes, I'm Margaret Thompson. I sent in my application 2 months ago. Jessica typed something into her computer, frowning slightly as she searched for Margaret's information. Oh, here you are, she said, sounding even more surprised. Well, okay then. She printed out a number and handed it to Margaret. You're contestant number 47. The competition starts at 10 o'clock. As Margaret took her number and moved away from the desk, she could feel Jessica watching her. She heard Jessica whisper something to another volunteer, and they both looked in her direction. Margaret pretended not to notice and found a quiet corner where she could sit and wait. The waiting area was filled with contestants practicing quietly, running through difficult passages on their phones or moving their fingers as if they were playing invisible pianos. Margaret sat down carefully and opened her music bag. Inside was the sheet music she had been practicing for months, Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. The pages were worn from being handled so many times, and she had made pencil notes in the margins to remind herself of important parts. A group of young contestants near Margaret were talking in voices that carried across the room. Did you see that older woman who just registered? One of them said with a laugh. I wonder if she knows what kind of competition this is. Maybe she thinks it's some kind of community talent show. Another voice joined in. My teacher always says these local competitions sometimes let anyone enter just to get more registration fees. It's kind of sad, really. Someone should probably tell her she's out of her league. Margaret tried to focus on her music, but the words hurt. She had worked so hard to get here, saving money for months to pay the registration fee and taking time off from her job at the elementary school. Every evening after teaching piano lessons to young children, she would practice on her old upright piano at home, working on the same piece over and over until her fingers ached. She thought about her late husband, Robert, who had always encouraged her musical dreams. You have something special, Maggie, he used to say when he heard her playing after dinner. Someday the world is going to hear what I hear. Robert had been gone for 2 years now, and Margaret had entered this competition partly in his memory, partly to prove to herself that it was never too late to chase a dream. The clock on the wall showed 9:30. Soon, the competition would begin, and Margaret would have her chance to show everyone what she could do. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to block out the whispers and doubts around her. In 30 minutes, she would walk onto that stage and play the music that had been living in her heart for so many years. At exactly 10 o'clock, the doors to the concert hall opened with a loud creak. Margaret looked up from her music and saw hundreds of people walking into the large room. The audience was mostly made up of families, music teachers, and important-looking people in expensive suits. Some carried notebooks and cameras, and Margaret guessed they were music critics or reporters from newspapers. The concert hall was even more beautiful than the lobby. Red velvet seats were arranged in perfect rows, and the stage was huge with bright lights hanging above it. In the center of the stage sat a magnificent black grand piano that looked like it cost more than Margaret's entire house. The piano gleamed under the lights, and she could almost hear the beautiful sounds it would make. Margaret found a seat near the back, next to an elderly couple who smiled at her warmly. The woman leaned over and whispered, "Are you here to watch your daughter or granddaughter perform?" Margaret shook her head politely and said, "I'm actually one of the contestants." The woman looked surprised but smiled anyway and wished her good luck. The competition began with a young man named David Chun, who was introduced as a graduate student from the famous Berklee College of Music. He walked onto the stage wearing a perfect black tuxedo, and the audience clapped loudly. His performance was technically very good, but Margaret noticed it sounded a bit like he was just showing off his finger speed rather than telling a story with the music. Next came a girl named Sarah Williams from the New York Academy of Music. She wore a stunning green dress that probably cost more than Margaret made in 3 months. Her performance was smooth and professional, but again, Margaret felt like something was missing. The music was perfect, but it did not touch her heart the way music should. One by one, the contestants performed. Each one had impressive credentials and fancy clothes. The announcer would read out their achievements: winner of the International Young Artists Competition, or student of the renowned Professor Martinez, or performed with the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Margaret listened to each introduction and felt smaller and smaller. Finally, after 23 performers, the announcer called out, "Next, we have contestant number 47, Margaret Thompson." There was a pause, and then he continued in a confused voice, "From Millbrook Elementary School." A ripple of laughter went through the audience. Margaret heard someone behind her say, "Millbrook Elementary? Is that some kind of joke?" Another voice added, "Maybe she's the school janitor." More people started laughing, and Margaret felt her face turn red with embarrassment. She stood up slowly and walked down the aisle toward the stage. With each step, the whispers got louder. "She looks like my grandmother," someone said. "What is she doing here?" asked another voice. A teenager in the front row actually pulled out his phone and started recording, probably planning to post a funny video on social media later. Margaret climbed the steps to the stage, and the bright lights made her feel dizzy for a moment. The audience looked huge from up there, and she could see people pointing at her and shaking their heads. Some were already reaching for their coats and bags, obviously planning to leave during what they expected would be an embarrassing performance. Behind the stage, the other contestants were watching on a small TV monitor. Margaret could not see them, but she could hear their voices. "This is so unfair," said the girl in the red dress. "They're letting just anyone compete now. It makes a mockery of the whole competition." A young man's voice joined in. "My teacher paid thousands of dollars to prepare me for this competition, and they let some random woman from an elementary school enter. What's next? Are they going to let high school students compete too? Someone should really screen these people better," said another voice. "She's probably going to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, or something equally embarrassing." Margaret heard every word, and each one felt like a small knife in her chest, but she had come too far to give up now. She thought about Robert, who had believed in her when no one else did. She thought about all the nights she had practiced alone in her small house, dreaming of this moment. She thought about her students at the elementary school, who looked up to her and trusted her to teach them about music. She walked to the piano bench and sat down carefully. The piano was bigger than any she had ever played, and for a moment, she felt overwhelmed. The keys were perfectly white and black, and they seemed to glow under the stage lights. She adjusted the bench height and position, just like she did every day at school. But this time hundreds of people were watching her every move. The audience was getting restless. People were talking loudly now, not even trying to whisper. Margaret heard someone say, "How long do we have to sit through this?" Another voice answered, "Hopefully not long. She'll probably realize she's out of her league and leave after the first few notes." Margaret placed her hands gently on the keys and closed her eyes. She tried to block out all the noise and negativity around her. She thought about the music. She was about to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. She had chosen this piece because it told a story of struggle and triumph, just like her own life. The hall was supposed to be quiet during performances, but people were still talking and laughing. Margaret could hear someone behind her making jokes about her simple dress and plain shoes. A woman in the audience was telling her friend about how these community competitions were getting out of hand by letting anyone enter. One of the judges, a stern-looking man with gray hair, glanced at his watch impatiently. The other judges were shuffling through their papers and looking like they wanted to be anywhere else. Clearly, they were expecting this to be a waste of time, something to get through quickly before the real competition could continue. Margaret took a deep breath. and opened her eyes. Her hands were steady now, positioned perfectly over the keys. She could feel the music building inside her, ready to pour out through her fingers. All around her, people were still talking and laughing, completely unaware that their lives were about to be changed forever. The moment had come. Margaret was ready to show everyone what 30 years of quiet practice and genuine love for music could create. She was ready to prove that sometimes the most extraordinary things come from the most ordinary places. She was ready to make every person in that room understand that they had made a terrible mistake in judging her. In just a few seconds, the laughter would stop, and the real music would begin. Margaret's fingers touched the piano keys for the first time, and something magical happened. The very first note that came out was so pure and beautiful that it seemed to float through the air like silk. The sound was rich and warm, completely different from the cold, technical playing everyone had heard before. The talking in the audience stopped immediately. It was as if someone had pressed a mute button on the entire room. People who had been laughing just seconds before suddenly found themselves holding their breath. The teenager who was recording with his phone nearly dropped it in surprise. His mouth fell open as he realized he was witnessing something completely unexpected. Margaret began to play Chopin's Belle on No. 1, and within the first few measures, everyone in the room knew they had made a terrible mistake. This was not the amateur performance they had expected. This was something extraordinary. Her fingers moved across the keys with a grace and confidence that spoke of years of dedicated practice and deep understanding of music. The melody that flowed from the piano was not just notes being played correctly. It was a story being told, a heart being opened, a soul being shared with everyone in the room. Margaret's playing had a warmth and emotion that none of the previous contestants had managed to achieve, despite all their fancy training and expensive clothes. In the audience, the elderly couple who had wished Margaret good luck were staring at the stage with tears in their eyes. The man whispered to his wife, "My God, listen to that. She's not just playing the piano, she's speaking to us through it." His wife nodded, unable to speak because she was so moved by what she was hearing. The three judges at the front of the room had completely changed their expressions. The stern, gray-haired man who had been looking at his watch impatiently was now leaning forward in his chair, his pen frozen in his hand. His mouth was slightly open in amazement. The female judge next to him had stopped shuffling through her papers and was staring at Margaret with intense concentration. The third judge, a younger man who had been checking his phone during previous performances, had put his device away and was listening with complete focus. Margaret's playing continued to grow more beautiful with each passing moment. The difficult technical passages that had challenged the conservatory-trained students seemed effortless under her fingers. But it was not just the technical skill that was impressive. It was the way she made the music sing, the way she brought out emotions that the audience did not even know they had. Behind the stage, the other contestants were watching on the monitor in complete shock. The girl in the red dress who had been so confident earlier was now pale and quiet. "How is this possible?" she whispered to the young man next to her. "She's just an elementary school teacher. Where did she learn to play like this?" The young man who had been making jokes about Margaret just minutes before was now shaking his head in disbelief. "I've been studying piano for 15 years, he said quietly. "I've had lessons with some of the best teachers in the country, but I've never heard anyone play with this much feeling, this much truth." Sarah Williams, the girl from the New York Academy of Music, was watching with a mixture of admiration and fear. She realized that her own technically perfect but emotionally cold performance earlier had been completely outshined by this unexpected woman. "She's not just playing the notes," Sarah whispered. "She's living them." Back in the audience, people were experiencing something they had never felt before at a piano competition. Usually, these events were about judging technique and precision. But Margaret's performance was touching something deeper in everyone who heard it. A businessman, in an expensive suit, found himself thinking about his own mother, who had played piano when he was young. A young music student realized for the first time what it really meant to make music from the heart. The music continued to build and flow, and Margaret seemed to become one with the piano. Her body moved gently with the rhythm, and her face showed the deep emotion she was feeling. She was not performing for the judges or the audience. She was simply sharing the music that had lived inside her heart for so many years. A music critic from the city newspaper, who had come to the competition expecting to write a boring review, was frantically taking notes. He had covered hundreds of classical music performances, but he had never heard anything quite like this. "Extraordinary," he wrote. "This is what music is supposed to be. This is why we fall in love with classical music in the first place." The teenager who had been recording was still holding his phone, but now he was recording something completely different than what he had planned. Instead of capturing an embarrassing moment to laugh at later, he was witnessing a moment of pure artistry that he knew he would want to remember forever. Margaret reached the most challenging part of the piece, a section that had caused several of the earlier contestants to stumble or play with obvious effort. But she navigated through it, as if she was simply having a conversation with an old friend. The difficult passages flowed naturally, and the emotion in her playing only grew stronger. The silence in the room was complete now. Even people who had been planning to leave were sitting completely still, afraid that any movement might break the spell that Margaret had cast over the entire audience. Children who had been fidgeting earlier were now sitting quietly, somehow understanding that they were witnessing something special. As Margaret moved into the final section of the piece, the emotion in the room was overwhelming. Many people were crying openly, not from sadness, but from the sheer beauty of what they were hearing. The music seemed to speak directly to each person's heart, reminding them of their own dreams, their own struggles, their own hopes. The judges were no longer judging. They were simply experiencing the music as human beings, feeling the same emotions as everyone else in the room. The gray-haired judge later said it was the first time in 20 years of competition, judging, that he had forgotten he was supposed to be evaluating a performance. Instead, he had simply been moved by the beauty of what he was hearing. Margaret was approaching the end of the piece, and everyone in the room knew that when the last note faded away, nothing would ever be quite the same again. They had all learned something important about music, about talent, and about the danger of judging people by their appearance. The simple woman from the elementary school was about to finish her performance, and when she did, the real applause would begin. As Margaret continued to play, something wonderful began to happen in the concert hall. People who had never met before started looking at each other with the same expression of amazement. Strangers were sharing a moment of pure beauty, and it was bringing them together in a way that words never could. An old woman in the third row was crying softly. The music reminded her of her late husband, who had loved classical piano. She had not listened to Chopin in years because it made her too sad, but hearing Margaret play made her remember all the joy that music had brought to their life together. The sadness was still there, but now it was mixed with gratitude for having loved someone so much. Near the back of the hall, a young mother was holding her baby daughter close to her chest. The little girl, who usually cried during loud events, was completely quiet and calm. It was as if Margaret's music was speaking to her in a language she understood perfectly, even though she was too young for words. The mother looked down at her peaceful baby and felt tears of joy running down her face. The music critics and newspaper reporters who had come to judge the competition were now struggling to find words to describe what they were experiencing. One of them, a woman who had been writing about classical music for 20 years, later said that Margaret's performance reminded her why she had fallen in love with music in the first place. She was not just playing notes, the critic wrote. In her review, she was sharing her soul with every person in that room. What the audience could not see was the story behind Margaret's incredible ability. They did not know that 30 years ago, she had been one of the most promising young pianists in the state. At 18, she had received a full scholarship to study at the famous Juilliard School in New York City. Her teachers had told her she had the talent to become a professional concert pianist, maybe even famous around the world, but life had other plans for Margaret. Just before she was supposed to leave for New York, her mother became very sick with cancer. Margaret was the only child, and her father had died when she was young. She could not leave her mother alone to fight the disease. So she made the hardest decision of her life. She gave up her scholarship and stayed home to take care of the woman who had raised her. For 3 years, Margaret nursed her mother through chemotherapy treatments and hospital visits. She got a job teaching piano lessons to children in their small town to pay for medical bills. When her mother finally recovered, Margaret was 21 and felt like she had missed her chance. The scholarship was gone, and she did not have money to pay for music school on her own. But Margaret never stopped playing. Every evening after teaching her students, she would sit at her old upright piano and practice for hours. She studied music books from the library and listened to recordings of great pianists. She taught herself advanced pieces that most people only learned in expensive music schools. Music was not just her hobby, it was her way of staying connected to her dreams. When Margaret was 25, she met Robert Thompson, a kind man who worked at the local bank. He loved to hear her play and would sit quietly in the corner of the room while she practiced. "You have magic in your fingers," he would tell her. "Someday the whole world should hear you play." They got married 2 years later, and Robert always encouraged Margaret to enter competitions and perform in public. But Margaret was busy raising their 3 children and working full-time as a piano teacher at the elementary school. She performed at church events and school concerts, but she never had time to pursue bigger opportunities. She was happy with her life, but there was always a small part of her heart that wondered what might have been. When Robert died suddenly from a heart attack 2 years ago, Margaret felt lost and alone. Her children were grown and living in other cities with families of their own. For the first time in 30 years, she had time to think about her own dreams again. She started practicing more seriously, working on pieces she had always wanted to master. The Golden State Piano Competition had been Robert's idea. He had seen the advertisement in the newspaper and circled it with a red pen. "Promise me you'll enter this," he had said just weeks before he died. "Promise me you'll show the world what I know you can do." Margaret had promised, and even though Robert was gone, she was keeping her word. All of this history, all of these years of practice and sacrifice and love, were flowing through Margaret's fingers as she played. The audience could feel the depth of experience in every note, even though they did not know the specific details of her story. They could hear the sadness of dreams delayed, the joy of love found, the pain of loss, and the courage to keep going. The other contestants backstage were beginning to understand that they were not just listening to a good performance, they were witnessing something that could only come from someone who had lived a full life and had something important to say through music. Technical skill could be learned in school, but the kind of emotional truth that Margaret was sharing came only from years of real experience. David Chun, the young man who had performed first, was watching the monitor with a new understanding. "My teacher always told me to play with feeling," he whispered to another contestant. "But I never knew what that really meant until now. She's not just playing with feeling, she's playing with a lifetime of feelings." As Margaret moved toward the final section of the Chopin piece, everyone in the room could sense that something incredible was about to happen. The music had been building to this moment, and they all knew that when it ended, they would never forget what they had witnessed. Margaret's performance was more than just beautiful music. It was proof that dreams never really die. They just wait for the right moment to come alive. The final notes of Chopin's Ballade rang through the concert hall like pure gold. Margaret's hands lifted slowly from the piano keys, and for a moment, the entire room was frozen in complete silence. It was the kind of silence that comes after something so beautiful that people need time to understand what they have just experienced. Then, like a dam breaking, the applause began. It started with one person clapping, then two, then suddenly the entire audience was on their feet. The sound was thunderous, like a waterfall of appreciation and amazement. People were not just clapping, they were cheering, shouting bravo. And wiping tears from their eyes, Margaret sat at the piano bench, looking out at the standing audience with surprise and joy. She had dreamed of this moment for 30 years, but the reality was more wonderful than anything she had imagined. The same people who had been laughing at her just 20 minutes ago were now giving her the longest standing ovation in the competition's history. The teenager who had planned to record an embarrassing video was now clapping so hard his hands hurt. The video he had actually captured showed the most incredible musical performance he had ever witnessed. Instead of posting it to make fun of Margaret, he decided to share it as an example of how wrong first impressions could be. The elderly couple who had wished Margaret good luck were crying with happiness. "That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard," the woman said to her husband. "She made me feel like I was young again, like anything was possible." The old man nodded, too moved to speak. The three judges were also standing and clapping. The stern gray-haired judge who had seemed so impatient earlier was now smiling widely. He had judged hundreds of competitions, but he had never heard anything like Margaret's performance. "Magnificent," he said to the other judges. "Absolutely magnificent. This is why we love music." Margaret stood up slowly and walked to the front of the stage. She had never received a standing ovation before, and she was not sure what to do. She gave a small, humble bow, which made the audience cheer even louder. As she walked off the stage, people in the front rows were reaching out to shake her hand and tell her how wonderful her performance had been. Behind the stage, the other contestants were waiting to congratulate her. The girl in the red dress, who had been so cruel earlier, was the first to approach. "I owe you an apology," she said with tears in her eyes. "That was the most incredible performance I have ever heard. You taught me something important about music today." David Chun, the first performer, shook Margaret's hand warmly. "Thank you," he said. "You showed all of us what it really means to play from the heart. I'm going to remember this performance for the rest of my life." One by one, every contestant came to congratulate Margaret. They had learned something valuable about music and about judging people too quickly. Sarah Williams from the New York Academy said, "I thought I knew everything about piano because I went to a fancy school. But you just taught me that the most important lessons come from life, not from textbooks." While the rest of the competition continued, word about Margaret's performance spread quickly through the building. People were calling their friends and posting on social media about the incredible woman who had surprised everyone. The videos and messages were not making fun of her, they were celebrating her amazing talent and inspiring story. The competition ended 3 hours later, but everyone knew who had won before the judges even announced the results. When Margaret's name was called as the first-place winner, the audience erupted in cheers again. She walked back onto the stage to receive her trophy, and this time she was smiling confidently. The lead judge spoke into the microphone. "In 40 years of judging musical competitions," he said, "I have rarely heard a performance that combined such technical excellence with such emotional depth." Margaret Thompson reminded us all today that true artistry comes not from where you studied, but from how deeply you understand and feel the music. After the ceremony, Margaret was surrounded by people who wanted to meet her and hear her story. Music teachers asked if they could bring their students to hear her play. A representative from a major recording company gave her his business card and asked if she would be interested in making an album. Local newspaper reporter interviewed Margaret about her background and her incredible performance. What would you say to other people who think they're too old to chase their dreams? The reporter asked. Margaret thought for a moment before answering. I would tell them that dreams don't have an expiration date, she said. It took me 30 years to get to this stage, but every year of practice and every life experience made me a better musician. Sometimes the best time to pursue your dreams is when you have the wisdom and experience to really appreciate them. The news story about Margaret spread across the internet within days. People all over the world were inspired by the story of the elementary school piano teacher who had shocked a prestigious competition. Her performance video was viewed millions of times, and comments poured in from people saying she had motivated them to pursue their own forgotten dreams. Margaret returned to her small town as a local hero. The elementary school where she taught held a special assembly so she could perform for her students. The children who had taken piano lessons with her for years were amazed to learn that their humble teacher was now famous. But Margaret remained the same kind, humble person she had always been. She continued teaching at the elementary school because she loved working with children. She also began giving concerts at nearby cities and received invitations to perform at music festivals. Most importantly, Margaret felt that she had kept her promise to Robert. She had shown the world what he had always known she could do. Every time she sat down at a piano now, she felt his love and encouragement with her. Margaret's story became a reminder to everyone who heard it that extraordinary talent can be found in the most ordinary places, and that it is never too late to let your dreams come true. The simple woman from Millbrook had touched thousands of hearts and proved that the most beautiful music comes from the most authentic places.